So we want to turn our attention here to the country of Honduras, where there's really a critical election upcoming here that, may change the status quo of what we've seen since the 2009 coup in Honduras. We are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Zoe Alexandra, who's a co-editor and journalist with the indispensable People's Dispatch. Zoe, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. I know I'm not supposed to say that anymore, super chat, sorry. But it really is. We're really grateful to have you here. And, I think for a lot of people, Zoe, probably the last time they've thought too much about Honduras is what happened in 2009. Maybe they've heard a little bit about the issue of drug trafficking and the president. But I think maybe just to start, give us a capsule view of the stakes in this upcoming election in Honduras.
Well, the upcoming election is a really important process. It'll be the fourth elections held since the coup d'etat in 2009. In the past three elections, the ruling party, the National Party of Honduras, of the far right, has won all of these elections, through, we'll get into it a bit later, I'm sure, but, not always through the most legal means. And in this upcoming elections, actually today, a poll was just released, and the left-wing candidate Xiomara Castro appears to be polling ahead by 17 points, ahead of the candidate of the National Party of Honduras. That's just one aspect of it. Of course, Honduras has been, mired in multi-level crisis over the past decade, which we've seen, especially in the United States, really come to boil over with the migrant crisis. The levels of poverty in Honduras are really, unheard of. I mean, over 70% of the population in poverty. Truly horrible conditions that the people of the country having to suffer through because of endemic corruption, because of the government just turning over all the natural resources, all of the, of its sovereignty to foreign companies, to, private capital, not in favor of the people. And so that is kind of the situation in Honduras today. There's, of course, high levels of violence, very low indicators of access to education, access to healthcare. We can go into it a bit later over the, the struggles that the people have been waging over the past decade. But, across the board, it has been a decade of resistance, but also extreme pushback, extreme repression from these forces that, were responsible for the 2009 coup d'etat.
Well, I really appreciate that capsule view. I mean, I think this has sadly been obscured from view here in the United States. I mean, it's come a little bit more into the forefront with Kamala Harris's trips to Central America. But I mean, it just seems like the height of hypocrisy, Zoe, what's happening here, because I mean, everything you just mentioned about how terrible it just, sort of a living, breathing human rights violation is the government of Honduras, yet they have almost total support from the United States. And Honduras is not on the list of governments that's demonized by the US. I mean, it just seems to speak to, maybe this is obvious, but it does seem to speak to a reality here that US policy in Central and Latin America is not, in fact, governed by the freedom, the democracy, and, whatever capacity building or whatever Kamala Harris was shopping when she was down there.
Sorry, that was
I think it's a clear example because, I mean, you see, even the Organization of American States, which has been fundamental in pushing Washington's agenda. Of course, we saw the very clear example in Bolivia, with Cuba historically, with Venezuela, in Honduras following the elections in 2017, which were in itself illegitimate in the sense that Juan Orlando Hernandez actually pushed forth a constitutional amendment saying that he could run for president again, when in Honduras it's illegal to run for a second term. Even then, he goes to the elections, commits massive electoral fraud. The Organization of American States is one of the first organizations to say these were illegitimate victory. He did not win the elections. Fraud was committed. And then as soon as the United States, which at this point Donald Trump was president, as soon as they gave their approval for this victory, we saw all the other countries fall in line. But there was actually massive outrage from countries that, usually would be on the side of, the US's allies in the region, because it was so brazen and just completely a violation of the people's will and really what the people were asking for. And following this electoral fraud, we saw, a horrific violence on the streets. The militarized police, which were created in the aftermath to the coup d'etat in 2009, just brutalizing the people on the street. Over 40 were killed, dozens rounded up and thrown in prison because they were opposing this completely illegal electoral fraud. And this is kind of, super important to keep in mind, especially for this upcoming electoral process, because we've seen that, even if the Honduran oligarchy commits outrageous crimes, making up ballots, I mean, it's really, really looking into, how they actually manufacture the victory is quite interesting. Even if they commit these crimes, the US is going to stand by them and say, yeah, not the same. Don't do it like that. It was a little too obvious, but you can get away with it. And so when we're seeing that Xiomara Castro, who's the left candidate from the LIBRE party, who actually made an alliance with the former presidential candidate from 2017, Salvador Nasrallah, they made an alliance. And can we expect that another situation of fraud could happen? It's unclear, but it's obviously on the table.
Mm.
Zoe, I'm curious if you could maybe also just describe a bit the guy that we're talking about, Juan Orlando Hernandez, because so much of what Venezuela is falsely accused of by the OAS with the backing of the US and what Nicaragua is accused of, they're constantly trying, and what Bolivia was accused of when Evo Morales won and then was pushed out in a coup that was backed by the US. It's always, election fraud, election fraud. And you mentioned that this right-wing apparatus has stayed in power all these years since the coup that the US backed because of election fraud that doesn't get called out. But we also constantly hear the US accusing these countries of narco trafficking and of so much violence against opposition. And I just think that, all of these complaints that we falsely hear about Nicaragua and Cuba and Venezuela actually do apply to America's allies, including the narco trafficking accusation. So can you shed some light on, the narco trafficking that's taking place when it comes to Honduras, which seems to take place, by the way, as you've mentioned before, in every country that has U.S. backing in Latin America? There seems to be a narco trafficking problem. But go ahead. Let's hear about this.
Yeah, this is a crucial element. Juan Orlando Hernandez, his brother Antonio Hernandez, is currently, in prison. He was accused in a New York City by a New York City judge for having participated in drug trafficking of, thousands of tons of cocaine, and using this money to help the presidential campaign of Juan Orlando Hernandez in 2013, 2014. And so this is a direct tie of the current president of Honduras to drug trafficking. He's even mentioned in the reports that that the prosecutors in New York have made. He's commonly referred to as co-conspirator 4. And so when these reports came out, of course, it provoked widespread outrage among the Honduran people. Reading the reports, it's quite clear that co-conspirator 4 is Juan Orlando Hernandez, just because of the contextual cues. And so following these charges and this report coming out, there were, once again, protests in the street against Juan Orlando Hernandez. Almost, since 2017, there have been constant protests, whether it be against his clear involvement in drug trafficking, which has been proven not only, within Honduras, but, by a U.S. court. This has been constantly denounced. He's also very implicated in corruption schemes, which of course are deeply linked to, illegal economy in the country. But under his watch, a UN-sanctioned corruption investigation committee was actually dismantled, and all of its power was taken away because they were precisely investigating members of his own party. They were arrested. It was Honduras' own Pandora Papers. And, a bunch, I think it was maybe over 20 members of the National Party were accused of having participated in corruption schemes. And they were, released. And also that this investigative body was dismantled and taken all of its powers. They couldn't look into corruption in the past. And, that was that. He's going to leave office as a sitting president, not stand trial for any of the multiple crimes that he has partaken in, from corruption to drug trafficking to violence against his own people.
Incredible.
It really is.
Incredible.
Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, it's Joe. I mean, you can just do whatever you want. Well, I mean, but it also seems. I mean, I actually want to ask another question, but I mean, obviously, Zoe, you also cover Colombia very closely, and it's like we're living in a bizarro world where allegedly Nicolas Maduro is running all drugs everywhere in the world, but in fact, like Colombia and Honduras is running the drugs. But we'll save that for another time, and certainly we'll absolutely have to keep talking about Colombia here, where there's many important things happening. But I also want to just ask you, in terms of Honduras, and you mentioned it earlier, talk a little, if you could, about what the popular movements have been doing, because I think this has been so invisibilized. You only really hear in terms of Honduras as immigration to the United States and violence and other things like that. And I think many people might assume there is nothing going on in terms of popular struggles.
For sure. I think this is a crucial element. And I think we can look at maybe the 2009 coup as kind of a turning point in resistance in Honduras. When the coup happened, it was unprecedented mobilizations were seen across the country. Many people went to the capital, and there was almost months of constant protests. People, popular organizations that had already existed in the country, protecting the Venezuelan embassy, protecting the Cuban embassy. So this is, movements on the streets who are very conscious of the role that Honduras plays in the imperialist, plan and the strategy in the Central America and the region as a whole, Latin America and the Caribbean. When the coup happened, the first actions that were taken were to strip the people of their fundamental rights. So, for example, there were attacks on labor. There were attacks on women's rights. Misoprostol, which is the pill, the morning after pill, which also is, emergency abortion pill, was taken away, was outlawed. Both misoprostol and the morning after pill. So attacks on women's rights. One of the key developments that happened after the coup was also the imposition of a neoliberal economic model. And so this saw, the opening up of free trade zones within Honduras. So giving transnational corporations essentially free reign over Honduran territory to not have to respond to the local legislation, labor codes, to not have to pay, a living wage, being tax exempt. And these created kind of these, tax havens, but also labor havens for transnational companies. And then at the same time, there was also kind of the attack on the territories of Honduras. So, just an all-out attack on natural resources and concessioning, key parts of the country where communities had historically lived and, existed and survived, and giving these to transnational corporations. So in the wake of this essentially neoliberal attack and onslaught, also to mention, this was a moment of intense militarization, the creation of the military police and other bodies directly supported by the U.S. government. The military police officers were all trained in the U.S. by U.S. Officers, a nice little program they have there. And so in the wake of this imposition of this, model of a society that's militarized, that's the people are not granted access to education and healthcare, all of their basic needs, where the territories where they've, existed and subsided and, resisted for decades and centuries are now being taken away from them, no clean drinking water. People organized in response to these attacks and, continuing decades of resistance that had already started. So I think we see the emergence of the LIBRE party in this moment. This came out of the National Front of Popular Resistance. This was created after the coup, and it, transformed into a party through this process of organizing a lot of times in the cities and with the traditional left in Honduras. And they were waging a lot of these battles, the labor battles with unions, In the territories, we see the strengthening of organizations such as the Civic Council of Indigenous and Popular Organizations of Honduras, COPIN. COPIN began to wage a series of very important battles in defense of the land. As I mentioned, that the coup, there was hundreds of concessions given to transnational corporations for hydroelectric projects, for mining, for timber, for all sorts of natural resources. And so people were resisting in the territories these projects, organizing communities, and all sorts of other resistance that has continued. In the past, in 2018, there was a massive mobilization of students, teachers, healthcare workers, because the government was cutting the already severely reduced budgets for public education and healthcare. In Honduras, there are 30 public hospitals, if you can believe it. There are probably more than 30 public hospitals just in New York City or the state of New York, and this country only has 30. So, really resisting against these attacks that were coming constantly to the people.
I mean, it just seems that this is such an important context because, obviously sort of one major side effect of this, of course, is the increased criminalization of immigrants here in the United States and people coming here, and also the demonization. And it just seems like, well, I don't know, I guess it seems like exactly what I'm saying, that you just can't separate the two issues. I mean, the way obviously people who hate immigrants in the United States point it is like, oh, well, they're coming here to steal our jobs or take our freedom. But I mean, hearing what you're saying, Zoe, I mean, it really feels that there is a direct connection between the risk people are taking to get from Honduras to the southern border of the United States and, what they're fleeing.
Yeah, I mean, if you can just look at the numbers of how, immigration from Honduras to the United States to see that this is directly linked. I mean, following the coup, there was a massive increase in immigration from Honduras to the US because people saw that they were not able to, maybe they were fleeing because of persecution. Maybe they were fleeing because they thought they could no longer get an education or, rights that they had enjoyed briefly under the government of Manuel Zelaya. Social programs that had been started were quickly taken away. And so, people, and then today, I mean, even in the past five years, these conditions have deteriorated even more. And so there, in 2018, with the first series of migrant caravans, thousands of people, risking everything, traveling with their young children because life in Honduras is unsustainable. The options for young people are to join the armed forces or the police, to join one of the criminal gangs, or to migrate. There's really nothing. It's very, very challenging to get an education. And even once you have a degree, there's no work because, the public sector has been hollowed out. We haven't even really gone into the horrific corruption that has happened in Honduras, but there was massive protests in 2015 against Honduras. In Honduras in 2015 against corruption. One of the big complaints then was that, for example, hospitals were giving people pills filled with flour. And so they were taking the money, instead of buying actual medicine, they were buying flour-filled pills. So these kind of things. If you see this, how do you survive? How are you gonna make ends meet? And they can't. So people are, of course, forced to flee their homes, endure a horrific trip in very challenging circumstances, maybe risking being in a detention center, but because Honduras is not a sustainable place to live right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a clear, bright red line. I mean, Honduras, El Salvador, Haiti, Cameroon, all these places where people are coming in such huge numbers. It's not only the social conditions, but the direct connection to the United States. But just real quick here, a few minutes left, give us a little taste of some of this corruption that you just mentioned there. I mean, hearing the flour pills, I mean, this seems like it's off the charts in terms of its seriousness.
Yeah, I mean, the flour pills was definitely, I think it's been one of the most symbolic, acts of corruption. But for example, in the pandemic, there was a pretty big multi-million-dollar contract Honduras made with a company to build, these campaign hospitals. So of course, as I mentioned, they only have 30 public hospitals. So when the coronavirus pandemic started, they were like, okay, let's try to prepare for the amount of patients that are gonna need to be attended to. And so they made a the government made a contract with a private company to build, I forget how many now, hospitals, that these temporary hospitals. And after, I think it was maybe after 7 months of this contract being signed and the money being dispersed, what do you know? There was about one hospital built out of dozens that had been promised. So things like these, in the capital Tegucigalpa, which is one of the most dangerous cities, in the world, probably, there's not really a standardized public transportation system. Again, there was a project to build those dedicated bus lanes with a centralized bus system, and they measured wrong. The buses were too big, the lanes were too small, and who knows where the money went. And now in the city, they have these bus lanes that don't work. They have the buses, were never bought, and they just stand there as a monument to this, endemic corruption of the ruling class in Honduras, which has been, given a free pass to run away with the money, not invest in the people, and not create a better life for the people that have been fighting for it for so many years.
Mm-hmm. Well, really appreciate you coming and giving us this primer for the upcoming elections in Honduras. And of course, I'll point people again to People's Dispatch. Great article up there. I believe it went up earlier this week about this. And Zoe, I believe you will be there on the ground. So we'll be able to keep following this and keep having you back here if you're willing on Breakthrough News to just help reveal what's really going on, because I think sadly and unfortunately the coverage from mainstream media won't be that good. But thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.